Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, I'm talking with Helen Thompson about the tortured relationship between Peter Mandelson and the leadership of the Labour Party. But we're not just talking about what's been happening this week, this month, not even what's been going on over the past year. This is a conversation covering more than 3 decades about the long history of New Labour. Just what kind of a drama has this been? Helen, the idea for this particular pair of conversations came out of a message that you sent me in February when Peter Mandelson's final disgrace took place, the one that led to the resignation of Morgan McSweeney, among other things, and threatened the position of the Prime Minister. That is an ongoing saga, and we will come back to it. And you said this is Act 5 of the New Labour drama. And it led me to think what Acts 1 to 4 were, how one would break it down, but also what kind of a drama it is. If this is a Shakespeare play, and in some ways it does have Shakespearean themes, is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? I think my assumption was, and we can discuss this as well, that it's a history play, in the sense that the history plays are about the battle for the crown on the whole. What it takes to win the crown, what it takes to hold on to the crown. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. And the treacheries that take place along the way, the alliances, but also the betrayals. And New Labour does have some of that feel to it across the arc of its history. So we are going to explore how this would play out if it were. It doesn't have to be a Shakespearean drama, but let's assume this is sort of Shakespearean. And some of the elements, as we'll see, do really sound Shakespearean. Apart from anything else, there are Scottish ghosts in this story. 5 acts. So one of the questions is, where are we going to draw the lines between the different acts and how they would be set up? I think I'm assuming that Act 1 would be, in this story, in this drama, Tony Blair seizing the leadership of the Labour Party in 1994. That's not where New Labour necessarily begins, and there is a backstory that we might touch on. It also has to be said that we are going to be not making Peter Mandelson the central actor in this drama, and I think one of the reasons it's not a tragedy is that Peter Mandelson's not really a tragic figure in that sense. But Peter Mandelson is an amazingly recurrent figure in all aspects of the New Labour drama, and certainly he was there at the beginning. So I guess my opening question would be, if this drama begins with Tony Blair seizing the leadership of the Labour Party and thereby displacing Gordon Brown, who had assumed it was not quite his birthright, though not far off, but certainly it was his destiny. And at the heart of that is the fact that Peter Mandelson, who had been a very close friend of Gordon Brown, and Gordon Brown had assumed would support him when this moment arose, Peter Mandelson's decision to support Tony Blair and indeed to help engineer Blair's victory was seen by Gordon Brown as a great betrayal. How much of the rest of the story was set by the fact that it seems to begin, at least in Gordon Brown's eyes, with a great betrayal?
Well, I think that question, David, a little bit turns on what we think about Gordon Brown and like whether in some sense he is a tragic figure. Because I agree with you that it is a history play, not really a tragedy. But if you were going to turn any of these 3 principal characters in New Labour into a tragic character, I don't say a tragic hero, I think it would have to be Brown. And so in Shakespearean terms, then the question is he destroyed by circumstance or is he destroyed by his own flaws? And I think it's quite hard to avoid the view that he's destroyed by his own flaws. I mean, in preparation for doing this, like you, I went back and looked at Andrew Rawnsley's book, The Party is Over, which he published, I think, in the first edition of it anyway, in 2010. Before the election, I think that's right for the first edition. And Brown in this book comes over, it has to be said, just appallingly. Some of his behaviour is quite monstrous. It's quite hard to find other words to describe in terms of the way in which he behaves towards his colleagues, not just Blair, but to other cabinet ministers, towards his advisors, towards the officials and secretaries who work in Number 10. And if you take that account at face value, and Rawnsley did spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people through a lot of years to write that book, though he clearly is much more sympathetic politically to Blair than to Brown, I think you would have to say that it was always going to go wrong for Gordon Brown, regardless of what happened back in 1994 after John Smith died. And then the tragedy of it, in the sense that it is a tragedy, is the chasm between Gordon Brown's ambition to be Prime Minister, regardless of Blair's or Mandelson's part in that, and the fact that he's entirely unsuited to being Prime Minister. And the bit, I think, that does give it a sort of certain tragic grandeur, at least in Rawnsley's account, are the moments when Brown knows that. He knows very acutely that he's not fit to be Prime Minister, that he doesn't have the right psychological profile for it, he doesn't have the right set of political skills for it, and the truth of it is crushing him, and that's why he's lashing out. And if you take that sort of version of it seriously, then in one sense, I don't think it mattered so much really what happened between Brown and Blair back at the beginning, even though it's undoubtedly the case that the very intense anger that Brown directed against Blair from 2001 onwards, the point when he thinks that Blair should stand down, is a function of what he thinks of as a broken pact made in a restaurant in North London.
So there are two betrayals there, in the sense that from 2001 on, Brown believed that Blair had promised him that they would effectively take turns, or at least Brown would succeed him much sooner than it happened. And of course, Blair had to be forced out in the end. So there was an understanding that they had come to an understanding, though they clearly saw it very differently. But then behind that, the role of Peter Mandelson, Brown, on the one hand, I think recognised that once Blair made his move, Brown couldn't compete. Blair more or less won that leadership by default because, I mean, Brown was a hugely ambitious man, and if he thought he could have taken the crown, he would have done, and he recognised that he couldn't. And yet he chose Mandelson as the person to blame for that. Mandelson, whom he had thought was his friend. And this has a lot to do with friendship. These people are friends. Those three men were friends, political friends, maybe more than personal friends, but they were friends. And Brown did believe that Mandelson had changed loyalties in a way that was a betrayal.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the many interesting parts of the story. There's no doubt, I think, that Mandelson takes the absolute brunt of Brown's anger and upset about what has happened, and that he's not going to be leader of the Labour Party after John Smith dies. And in a way, I think that is a very personal telling of the story that does speak to the nature of the friendship between them, because there would have been another way of looking at it, a bit more rationally, I think, which would have been that there was very little support within the shadow cabinet at that point for Brown over Blair. And we should remember that it's not that Peter Mandelson is in this shadow cabinet because John Smith has really disliked Peter Mandelson. He hasn't wanted him there. So although that Mandelson had won his seat in Hartlepool in the 92 election, he's not a player in that sense. He's a behind-the-scenes player with Brown and Blair. So it doesn't really make sense to think that the reason why Brown can't succeed in 94 is because of Mandelson's meddling, to put it in those terms, because Mandelson at the top level is not influential enough to be able to swing that. The reason why Brown can't win is because there's insufficient support at the top of the Labour Party for him. So the fact that after Blair becomes leader, that Mandelson bears the full brunt of Brown's anger, there is a certain, in fact, a deep, I would say, irrationality to that, which speaks to the psychodrama of what then goes on and what consumes New Labour in so many different ways. And I don't just mean because of where it all leads to in the end today, but in terms of relations within that government and the way that government was conducted for pretty much the entire time that Blair and Brown were prime ministers between them.
So to that point, as to whether this is a tale of a tragic figure brought down by flaws rather than circumstance, two things on the circumstance side of the ledger. So I said there are Scottish ghosts in this story. So one is John Smith. John Smith's death. John Smith was a relatively young man. I think it's almost certainly the case that had he lived, he died in 1994, had he lived, he would have become Prime Minister in 1997. And it wasn't simply that Peter Mandelson was not in the core John Smith team. John Smith profoundly distrusted Peter Mandelson and everything that he stood for. One of the things that John Smith believed, perhaps naively, was that he was not going to go down the route that Mandelson had, he thought, taken the Labour Party down when Neil Kinnock was leader, towards what he saw as a more gimmicky, communications-oriented politics. Had Smith lived and become Prime Minister, it's unlikely, at least during that period, that Mandelson would have found his way back to the heart of things. But also, presumably, in Brown's mind, it is the case that had Smith lived, Gordon Brown, who was very close to John Smith, and this is part of that Scottish axis of Labour politics, Gordon Brown was undone by John Smith's death. And then the second thing, I completely agree. The accounts of Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister are eye-popping, and he really does not seem like a man who is going to be capable of playing this role. He is far too angry. He's far too distressed. But the circumstances were distressing. It was a difficult time. He made one big mistake, and we'll come on to it, which was to do with an election that he seemed to be about to call and didn't call. But after that, it was a tough time to be Prime Minister. No Prime Minister has ever had a better time to be Prime Minister than Tony Blair in 1997. He inherited a golden kingdom. We're going to use these terms. I mean, the lay of the land was extraordinarily favourable. And I've often wondered, had it gone the other way, and it's a big if because it's hard to see how it could have gone the other way, given, as you said, actually when push came to shove, there wasn't that much support for Gordon Brown, which, if nothing else, suggests that his colleagues were extremely doubtful that he was the right man to be leader and then Prime Minister. But still, had it gone the other way and Brown had inherited and then inherited the kingdom in 1997 under those conditions, if the New Labour story had been the other way around, first Brown and then Blair comes in at the end, rather than first Blair and Brown comes in at the end, might not a Brown premiership have been different? Might he possibly be the kind of political leader who could have thrived in favourable circumstances? Those flaws seem to have been drawn out of him in part by the circumstances in which he did finally inherit.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think several things. First of all, in so many ways, the first Blair premiership is Brown's premiership. And I think that this is where the story does become complicated, because the effective deal that they seem to make is that Brown is going to run the domestic show and that Blair is going to deal with foreign policy. There are certain things, I think, that cut across that, and this will really matter in the second term when they're really at war with each other. And the first is Europe, whether that counts as a domestic question, or particularly joining the euro, or whether it counts as a foreign policy question. And each of them, not just actually because they want it to be in the realm where they're in control, but they actually substantively disagree about whether it's a foreign policy question or whether it's a domestic economic question. And health, I think, is the other one where Blair wants quite a big say in what Brown thinks is in his domestic sphere. And I think, and this is sort of reflecting back on the time and what I remember from then, I think there was a strong sense. I certainly think that I had a sense by 1999 is that really that Brown was running the show and that Blair was the figurehead. And the thing that changed that was Kosovo, the Kosovo War in 1999. And I remember my sort of maybe pretty naive take at the time was, but I remember having it, was that probably we sat around and discussed it, was that Kosovo and Blair's enthusiastic embrace of that war against Serbia was in significant part because it gave Blair something to do. It was way outside Gordon Brown's realm. And that Blair was keener being a foreign policy Prime Minister, and this gave him the stage in which he needed to project prime ministerial authority. I think that then that goes into the fact that in the early part of the New Labour project, and this was true, I think, in opposition as well as in that first term, that being, as Brown saw it, macroeconomically credible, demonstrating that Labour was pro-business and it was pro-markets, and the financial markets, particularly the foreign exchange markets, could trust new Labour. That's what distinguished them from old Labour. That was fairly fundamental. And the person who was doing the running on all that, who was constructing New Labour's macroeconomic policy, was Gordon Brown and his advisors, particularly a young Ed Balls. And that was symbolised, if you like, in the decision, which I don't think Blair really had anything to do with, of giving operational independence to the Bank of England very quickly after the election had been won, not something that had been in the manifesto. And so I think that there was then this tension in which Brown kind of thought he was running the show, that he was in some sense Prime Minister, and that the next step was to take over the form of it as well as the substance of it. And yet there was some very real sense in which he wasn't, because he, although the domestic remit was wide, went way beyond the Treasury, there was still the whole world stage, if you like, a European stage, in which it really was the Blair show. Now, then the question, to get back to your question, David, that arises from that is, well, would Brown have done much better at that aspect of it and the communications aspect of it if he could have allied it with his "we're so good macroeconomically," which was the narrative that he put on what he saw as New Labour's macroeconomic success? And I'm not so sure. I can see the case for it. Certainly, it's nowhere near as difficult as dealing with the set of issues at stake by 2008, when the crash has happened and Russia's invading Georgia, and generally things are becoming a lot more geopolitical. But that whole set of issues about how do you deal with 100 different things a day, or however many different things a prime minister is supposed to deal with at the same time, which Brown seems, at least in Rawnsley's account, really bad at when he does become prime minister. That would still have been there in the first term.
So just one more aspect to that counterfactual, which is, it is also the case that given how it did play out, Gordon Brown, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, did want to constrain the power of the Prime Minister as much as he could. And so the macroeconomic policy that he adopted was partly, it was convenient as well as possibly being the thing that he believed was right for the New Labour project. Had he been Prime Minister, I don't know, I'm sure he probably would have given operational independence to the Bank of England, but he might have had more pause if he thought he was going to be the one who was not just in the Treasury, but actually running the government. And I agree that would he have done a better job presentationally than Blair? Almost certainly not. Would the complex range of things, because he would have been a prime minister who would have tried to manage across the whole piece in the way that Blair didn't. I mean, Blair was able to be good presentationally because he did leave a lot of economic questions to the Treasury. You can be quite sure Gordon Brown, I don't know, do we know who he would have made Chancellor? Can we guess who he would have made Chancellor? I don't know. It wouldn't have been Alistair Darling back then. But I'm assuming it would have been a very different Prime Minister-Chancellor relationship, in that the Chancellor would have been subservient to the Prime Minister. In that government, Blair would presumably either have been Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary, which are very different kinds of roles. And actually, the people who hold those roles rarely go on to be Prime Minister. Occasionally they do. Theresa May made that leap. So Blair would have posed a much less of a threat to Brown than Brown did to Blair. And I'm just wondering whether, if Brown had thought, I am going to be Prime Minister, he would have been a little bit less fierce about the macroeconomic credibility question, because he was in part constraining the Prime Minister by adopting that set of policies.
I see what you're getting at. The only thing I would say is I do think that in terms of there being substance to New Labour, this issue of being macroeconomically safe and credible, to use the language of the time, was very, very important. And in that sense, I think that Brown could reasonably claim that in policy terms, he did more to define what New Labour was than Blair did. And I think that gets to an interesting question, like bringing Mandelson back into it, is, well, what was Blair's particular contribution to this New Labour project? Because I think you could argue that the macroeconomic part of it, which I think is central policy-wise, was Brown. You could argue that the strategy and tactics of electoral politics and framing was Mandelson. And then that Blair was the front man. The thing that Blair brought to the show was a certain kind of fluency in communication, and communicating in ways that wasn't off-putting to group of voters who still had some nervousness about voting for Labour, particularly those ones who actually were direct switches from Conservatives to Labour between the 92 and the 97 election.
And put in those terms, what makes it so fascinating as a drama is, therefore, that was the strongest possible combination. Actually, they were all in the right roles. That was what Blair was best at. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, education, education, education. It's not a substantive contribution to the New Labour project, but these are the lines that people remember. Mandelson was very good at the strategy and indeed the tactics and indeed the methods of electoral politics. And Brown was in the right role as the person giving strategic vision to the overall macroeconomic project. And yet, them all being in the right roles was toxic. Completely toxic. That's what it needs Shakespeare to. So in Act One, which presumably in this play would have as its central scene a reconstruction of an event of which we do not have a record, the dinner at Granita, different accounts of what might have been said, what the promise was, what promise was made, what promise was kept, what promise was broken, presumably the two parties having a very different memory of what was actually said. But it puts everyone in their right role, and out of that, you get 30 years of poison right the way through to today. I mean, you and I are speaking as Keir Starmer is on his feet in the House of Commons defending the vetting process or the failures of the vetting process, or justifying his ignorance of the failures of the vetting process in relation to Mandelson's appointment. And Gordon Brown is still there in the background, wanting Mandelson jailed. The poison that was ejected at Granita runs through British politics like a river for a generation.
As we know, I can't remember now, at some point earlier in the year, wasn't it, that was reported that Brown was handing documents over to the police in relation to Mandelson. Well, in Act One, in our story, the first time that Mandelson is sacked from Blair's cabinet in 1998 is over this loan that he's taken from Geoffrey Robinson. And again, I'm just relying on the Rawnsley account here, but in Rawnsley's account, it's Brown's people who have leaked the information about that, and that Mandelson holds responsible for his sacking. Because although I think it's reasonable to say that the deep animus that Brown ends up showing towards Blair only really manifests, or at least at its almost near psychotic level, after the 2001 election, there's plenty of it towards other ministers, including Mandelson, perhaps particularly Mandelson in the first term, and this is the first evidence of it. I mean, there is that little moment as well, because obviously we kept him out so far, but there's Alistair Campbell as well, who would seem the source, but who knows, probably the source for the, often seen, and let's put it that way, as a source for the comment that, or the briefing to Rawnsley when he was back in 1998, that Brown had psychological flaws. I mean, so you can see very early on, so that's a year in, you have seemingly, I want to say seemingly, because as I say, it's never been absolutely clear who did this, but the Prime Minister's communication director briefing against Brown, and that you have Brown's people essentially manoeuvring in ways that lose Mandelson his job.
So I think I had imagined that if Act One was Blair becoming leader, it's quite hard to know how you put these things in acts because there's so much time to be covered here. And if this is going to work as a play, we've got to pick out particular scenes. But I feel like Act Two in this drama are the various betrayals of Peter Mandelson, at least in his own mind, because, as you say, in 1998, he had to resign. And it's almost certainly the case that Brown or Brown's people, not just Ed Balls, but others, Charlie Whelan, Damien McBride, I think, was already knocking around then. In Shakespearean terms, genuine henchmen were instrumental in letting the press know the details they needed to know to bring Mandelson down the first time. But Mandelson then had to resign again, having been brought back by Blair into his cabinet, second time round as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which in itself is quite a sort of Shakespearean idea. Mandelson, at various points in the second crisis that brought him down, was in Stormont, having meetings with the head of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and then on the phone back to London trying to defend himself. The first case, it was a home loan scandal. In the second case, it was a passports for access or cash scandal involving the Millennium Dome. I mean, everything about New Labour was encapsulated in this. But second time around, he blamed not Brown, but Alistair Campbell and ultimately Blair himself. He thought Blair let him down second time around and chickened out. So in the second resignation, it turned in a way that these things with hindsight, it all seems so small with the distance of time, but it turned, I think, on a phone call, whether Mandelson had or hadn't made a phone call to the Foreign Office, essentially pushing the case of the Hindujas, who were the people who'd given money to the Millennium Dome project, and then they either had or hadn't been rewarded with fast access to British citizenship. That was the question on which it turned. And at the heart of that was the question whether Mandelson, who was heavily involved in the Millennium Dome project, a New Labour vanity project, essentially, whether he had been personally instrumental in that, or whether he was his officials, he had simply, the stuff with Starmer today touches on this a bit, whether he had simply been doing things that the system had a mind of its own and a life of its own, and he had maybe acquiesced in or signed off on things of which he was not fully aware. And it turned on the question of a phone call. And he thought both Campbell and Blair rushed to judgment. They condemned him. They were frightened of the press. They more or less chickened out in the face of what they thought the Daily Mail might do, rather than backing their friend. Second time around, second resignation for Peter Mandelson, the betrayal that he felt was not Brown's revenge. It was Blair not backing him. So I kind of feel that is Act Two. I mean, I think there's got to be more in Act Two, and we need to take this story further to the beginning of Blair's own undoing. But in a way, when you read the accounts of this, and it is so personal, so much of this, so much of it is about that feeling of friends letting down friends. Mandelson felt betrayed by Blair in the end, and yet it didn't break their political relationship. Within a few months of resigning second time round, he was back, being rung up by Blair, advising Blair. He wasn't back in the cabinet, he was behind the scenes. Blair had to conceal the extent to which he was dependent on Mandelson. But it was a betrayal, but not a betrayal that broke a political relationship.
No, I think the thing, Mandelson, on that, I think there's some kind of official investigation and he is actually exonerated. And his charge is that Blair jumped to judgment way too soon. And again, in Rawnsley's account, Mandelson is still bringing this subject up years later. I think, though, it's clear that the reason why Mandelson ends up back in the kitchen cabinet, if you like to use that term, is because things, by this point, certainly by 2002, early 2003, become pretty appalling between Brown and Blair. Well, we should make clear, actually, just one thing, just going back a little bit into the first act, is there's a lot of discussion between Blair and his closest advisors in the run-up to the 2001 election about whether they should sack Brown and sort of dress it up by making him Foreign Secretary and have a different Chancellor. And Blair backs off that because he's scared really about what the consequences for the government will be of splitting it. So you've got both Brown and Blair after the 2001 election going off in what are radically different directions in terms of policy, I think, as well. And the euro, and whether to join the euro or not, becomes the big policy divide between them. But their relationship is also sufficiently broken down on both sides that each of them is looking to do without the other. And it's in that space that Blair brings Mandelson back in for help, as much as anything, as way I read it, for dealing with Brown. And then you've got two different things going on. You've got the Euro question where Mandelson is absolutely on Blair's side substantively and regards Brown and the Treasury as just putting economic obstacles or macroeconomic obstacles, his 5 tests as they were called, in the way for the sake of it.
And just to be clear, Mandelson and Blair by this point wanted to join the euro, and Blair started to believe it was part of his historical destiny to be the British Prime Minister who took Britain into the euro. And Brown's position on the euro shifts over time, but Brown by this point, and whether this is principle or whether it is because Blair wants to do it, is going to stop them.
Absolutely. And it also goes on for a long time because he keeps saying that these tests are good. It takes a long time for the Treasury to do all this technical work. And Blair's not got the slightest bit interested, obviously, in the technical detail of it or really any of the economic detail of it. He just thinks of it as a geopolitical question, essentially Britain in Europe. That's what matters, leading Europe in his own mind. But the thing that's going on at the same time, which is, I think, really the end of Act Two, is Iraq and the build-up to Blair's decision to take Britain into the Iraq war with the United States without there being a second authorizing resolution at the United Nations. And what's interesting in the trio story here is that I think in lots of ways that Brown and Mandelson's position are closer to each other than they are to Blair's. The one person who is as emphatically in favour of Iraq around Blair as him is Jonathan Powell, his chief of staff.
Now Keir Starmer's chief foreign policy advisor.
Exactly. And Mandelson is, I mean, in the end, both Brown and Mandelson go along with it and accept it. But I think that both of them, for somewhat different reasons, are sceptical. And there is a sense that hanging over all this moment about Iraq, that the consequences of it going wrong for Blair are that Gordon Brown will become Prime Minister. And I think everybody in the cabinet understands there's a crucial cabinet meeting where that if Brown were to say, I'm opposed to the war, and at this point, or around this point anyway, I can't get quite the timeline right, then two people are resigning from the cabinet, Robin Cook, who has been deposed by Blair as Foreign Secretary and is now leader of the House, and Claire Short, but Brown won't do it. And you could read that as caution in terms of like, what will he inherit if he takes over in that kind of crisis? You could read it, I think, as when it really comes to it, Brown is too much of an Atlanticist to break with the Americans over it. But interestingly, I think on Mandelson's side, it's, well, if this goes wrong and we don't back Blair, the consequence of it is going to be Brown being Prime Minister. And Mandelson, I think, at that point would want anything other than Brown being Prime Minister. So even then, when Brown and Mandelson are kind of sort of agreeing, I think, and being sceptical about Blair's foreign policy decision-making, it's still that this clash that is deciding at least which way Mandelson's going.
It almost does need Shakespeare to do justice to this, because for both Brown and Mandelson in this, there is something profoundly compromised and compromising about the positions that they adopt. For Brown, it is true, you could say the upside for him in backing this war that he doesn't really believe in and that he suspects has not been properly thought through by the Americans, is it might hasten the end of Tony Blair. But of course, it also hastens the end of New Labour in the sense that it enormously tarnishes the New Labour project. And Gordon Brown is never going to be able to distance himself from that tarnishing of it. At the same time, for Mandelson, my memory of this, including reading Mandelson's own memoir, is that he was, maybe with hindsight, but he suggests that he was, like Brown, sceptical of the war. At the same time, he was probably prime among the people at this point who was trying to push Blair into, if not sacking Brown, because that was too incendiary, and if Brown wouldn't accept being Foreign Secretary, the plan for a while was to break up the Treasury, sort of thing that prime ministers are always thinking of doing to try and take on the power of the Treasury, break it up into two departments and give Brown one of them, but give someone else the other. How they would divide it, I can't remember. At one point, Mandelson believed that he'd got Blair's agreement that he would break up the Treasury in two, and then Blair chickened out. But my memory of that memoir is not quite explicitly, but between the lines. Mandelson's position before the Iraq War was to try and remind Tony Blair that the real enemy is not Saddam Hussein, it's Gordon Brown. This is what you should be focusing your Prime Minister on. You've been distracted. Reading Blair's memoir, to go back to your point about Kosovo, it was clear that on 9/11, part of the sense of release that he felt, he says it was a sense of release because the world made sense to him again. He understood which side everyone needed to be on. But it was completely clear it was also release because he thought, now this government is going to go into places where Brown can't stop me. This has changed the terms between me and my Chancellor. And that was, even if he wouldn't admit it to himself, a big part of his sense of psychological release, which he describes watching the planes hit the Twin Towers. He almost describes it as a moment of horror/euphoria because, as he says, now the dots started to join up. But actually what he saw was a vision of his prime ministership in which he would be free. Brown wouldn't be able to stop him. I don't know if this is Shakespearean. I don't know what it is, but the psychology of those three in that moment, in each case, the vision is so tainted already by the stain of what's happened to their personal relationships.
It is, and I think the other thing then is that into this, obviously through Iraq comes this unquestionable tragedy for an individual who's not any of them. It's David Kelly, the weapons inspector, who Alistair Campbell has effectively outed as somebody who leaked information about the intelligence reports that Blair and Campbell were using to justify the war, leaked them to the BBC, and then David Kelly took his own life. And this is obviously a terrible tragedy for him, and it produces probably the low point, perhaps even for anything that was going to happen in the Blair premiership, in terms of the effect that and his unpopularity, Blair's unpopularity, I mean, by that then has, because he goes into this, again, in Rawnsley's account, within 6 months after this happening, he's still in this terrible place psychologically, in which he's not clear he wants to carry on as Prime Minister. And Brown, by this point, thinks it's absolutely his opportunity. He's practically working out who's going to be in his cabinet. And there's a point then, as I recall, when John Prescott steps in and they have another dinner, except this time there are three people. The Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, is there between them as well. And Brown thinks he's got another commitment from Blair, which is to leave in the summer of 2004. And I think there's the possibility then that Blair could have quit. But then the people, again, Mandelson, Sherry Blair, Jonathan Powell, the people who can't stand Brown are all rallying around him, saying, no, you just got to hang in there. The bad times will pass. You'll feel like doing it again. And he does start feeling better about being Prime Minister. And there we have, Brown got a whole new round of fury, perhaps in some sense more legitimately than the first time.
And in this play, the death of David Kelly produced one of those moments, one of those lines that is still remembered in Blair's premiership. He was on a plane, I think, flying back from Tokyo when the news of David Kelly's death broke. And a journalist said to him, "Prime Minister, have you got blood on your hands?" Not, have you got blood on your hands in Iraq, which is another question, but have you got blood on your hands? And by all accounts, Blair went white and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. And that would be in this play somewhere too, for sure. But I'm guessing if that's Act 2, Act 3 begins with Gordon Brown finally, after 10 years, seizing the crown through 2006 through to 2007. It was a long, drawn-out coup, if a coup it was.
I think it was a coup.
It was a coup, but it was a coup, or it was a coup delayed in the sense there was a coup in 2006, but Blair only left in the summer of 2007. It also would have to include those moments along the way where Brown made sure that he wouldn't be challenged for the leadership, because presumably by this point, scarred first time around, but also he was self-aware enough to know he had made many, many, many enemies over the preceding 10 years. And he couldn't be sure if David Miliband, for instance, challenged him for the leadership, what might happen. He probably could be reasonably secure he would win it, but whether he would win it with his legitimacy questioned. And he did some fairly dark arts things in order to ensure that he inherited the crown without a challenge, which is what happened, and entered Downing Street in the summer of 2007, briefly for about a week or so, seemingly master of all he surveyed. I remember Brown's first week. I remember the press coverage he got, the sense of relief that Blair was finally gone. People were sick of Blair by that point, sick of the sanctimony, sick of the sight of him, I think. 10 years is a long time to be Prime Minister. Brown was meant to be the grown-up. This is all very reminiscent of the first week of Keir Starmer's Prime Ministership. Brown created what was called the government of all the talents. He brought in people who weren't politicians. He brought in business people. I think Alan Sugar was one of them, unless I'm mistaken. For American listeners, that's the person who hosts our version of The Apprentice, but he will never be Prime Minister. And it lasted such a short period of time. That, I think, is the start of Act 3. But at the heart of Act 3 is, to me, the most fascinating part of this whole story, which is the rapprochement between Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson. Peter Mandelson comes back and Brown brings him back into government, a man with whom his relationships were absolutely toxic. Poisonous is the word for them. These two had been at each other's throats. And in 2008, once Brown's prime ministership was in trouble, he brought Peter Mandelson back. To me, the revelation in the Andrew Rawnsley book was that he says, I don't know if this is true, but there's no reason to make it up because it's not a particularly interesting detail for anyone other maybe than you and me. He says that Brown, still full of mistrust, of Mandelson, suspicion. But Peter Mandelson came to Cambridge in February 2008. Peter Mandelson was the EU Trade Commissioner at this point. He'd left British politics in that sense. He was no longer an MP. He came to Cambridge in February 2008 to give a lecture hosted by our department, your and my department, the politics department in Cambridge. You and I were both at this lecture and then at the dinner afterwards with Peter Mandelson. And apparently this lecture so impressed Brown with its analysis of the challenges of globalization that he asked his people to arrange a lunch with Mandelson, which happened soon afterwards. For 20 minutes, they glowered at each other, still full of mutual suspicion and poison. And then the ice was broken by talking about this lecture. And before long, Brown had decided he needed Mandelson back. If I was writing this play, that would be in there somewhere. But you sent me the text of the lecture. And wow, that was the lecture that overcame Shakespearean levels of mistrust and feelings of betrayal.
I must admit, I didn't sit and read every word of it before I sent it to you, David. But the thing that is most striking about it now is that it just belongs to another world. And it is really Mandelson defending globalization against the challenges and really being very confident, I think, that he, as trade commissioner, which is the position he was serving in the commission, could deliver a new world trade agreement, because there hadn't been a successful one since the Uruguay round that had established the World Trade Organization. And Mandelson was trying to push on the EU side, the Doha round, I think it was called, through. And the challenge that was coming to it, well, there were several ones, but there's developing country protectionism, but there was also sort of a more protectionist spirit in the US Congress, at least by that point. And so for Brown to be sort of impressed by it, it would be like Brown wanting to embrace the global, to defend it at a point when, it's nothing like the threats that are going to overwhelm it, which is why it seems now to be, the lecture now seems to belong to another world. It's quite hard to imagine. I was thinking about this. It's quite hard to imagine that that's the lecture that Tony Blair would have given. And it should be said as well, the lecture was actually, wasn't it, was the Alkin lecture, which is a lecture that Leon Britton had set up. And Alkin being a Northumbrian monk who'd been an ambassador, I think, or been at Charlemagne's court. And so it was also an occasion, and you can see this in the lecture, of embracing the European cause in the face of globalization. And that's interesting, again, from Brown's point of view, in sort of responding to that, because Brown was very keen on his Eurosceptic credentials in many ways at that point. And it wasn't just a question of the victory he'd won over Blair and keeping Britain out of the euro, but as Prime Minister, he did as much as possible to make it clear how much he disliked having to sign the Lisbon Treaty. I think, as I recall, that he refused to go to the ceremony, the main ceremony for signing it, and did it himself independently. So I think you might read it as much as anything as that saying something about the depths to which Brown's premiership had sunk so quickly by that point. And interestingly, there's the election that never happened. Obviously, we can come to that. But the issue I think that's causing him so much grief by the summer of 2008 is this issue of having got rid of the 10 pence income tax rate. So something on his own territory. He's got Alistair Darling as Chancellor, but he's clearly driving the decisions still. He's not really taking any notice of Darling. They end up having furious rows. But he's made a mistake, a political electoral mistake that really does harm Labour, because it means that poorer people are paying more taxes on the area where he claimed he knew absolutely best. This was supposed to be vintage Brown, and this was where he'd made his terrible mistake.
When I reread the lecture, the thing I was struck by is that Mandelson's case for Europe is also a case against the United States. And he says we have to, we've got to make a bet here in the era we're living in. It's an era in which globalization is inevitable, but it's going to come under strain in various ways. And it's February 2008, so it's not clear that Obama's going to be president. This is George W. Bush's presidency still. Northern Rock has happened, but Lehman Brothers hasn't happened yet. As you say, the United States is showing signs of moving towards both protectionism and the beginnings of a kind of populism, but we haven't yet got to the Tea Party movement. But Mandelson more or less says in that lecture, you've got to put a bet here. You've got to put your bet on Europe, because Europe combines real social security, the protection of a established welfare system, a complete belief in rules of law and an international order. America looks vulnerable. America does not have welfare protection of the kind that Europe can offer. America seems to be drifting towards protectionism. America looks like it might be, as it always has, a bit iffy about the rules of the international order. So if you're going to put your money on something, you're going to put your money on the European Union. That was bad prophecy. I mean, with hindsight at least, but maybe even at the time, it was that was a misreading of the inherent strengths of the United States in the disorder that was to come.
What's interesting here is I remember actually having a disagreement with him at the dinner. I should say I'd never met him before that evening, but there weren't that many people at the dinner, as I recall. And there was a certain point in the evening when it went to collective conversation, and he was being very upbeat about securing this trade agreement, and essentially that Europe, as I recall at least, that Europe could lead on this. And I asked him something about the Bush administration not having fast-track authority, which meant that the Senate would be a constraint. And he didn't think that that was relevant really at all. But the answer came that he gave me is from a conviction that Europe could lead. And that is, I think, both turned out not just to be, wrong, but that what is just not there in that lecture is a sense that Europe and America are just going to economically diverge. That in the 2010s, as the global comes under this intense pressure, becomes so geopolitically contested, that the United States economy is going to do a lot better than either the European Union economy collectively or most of the individual European economies. I know there's some exceptions, like Poland, but generally the West European countries did not have a good 2010s. And I think that what's interesting about that in terms of the bigger picture story is that this notion that was so crucial to at least Brown's conception of New Labour, that they understood the economic world, or at least that he understood the economic world, he and his advisors did, that their analysis was good, and that their analysis was what made them competent, and that's what distinguished them from the Conservatives. I think you can see that the analysis around 2008 and what it meant was really poor. And I'm just using that as a symptomatic of it, not because it's the most revealing example of it, just because it's one we saw. And actually, the New Labour just wasn't going to be equipped. Even leaving the personalities and the implosion out of it, it would not going to be equipped for the economic and geopolitical world as it was in the 2010s. And in that sense, there's a certain kind of fitness, if in a way, to Labour's absence from power during the decade to come. And it was going to take the Conservatives' implosion. So nothing that actually Keir Starmer would do to reinvent New Labour, which in one sense was what he was trying to do, but there's nothing there in terms of the reinvention. It's just the fact that the economic and political forces that are going to accumulate through the 2010s and the first years of this decade are just going to destroy British governments.
That dinner, the Alcuin dinner, was also the dinner I remember. I only had one conversation with Peter Mandelson, which was after the dinner was over. We were standing outside. I was waiting to go home. He was waiting for his driver to come and pick him up. He was very polite. He said to me, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm writing a book about political hypocrisy." He punched me in the chest and said, "I am not a hypocrite." And I said, "The book's not about you, Peter." The other memorable thing I can remember from the many years of attending these Alcuin lectures is the one in 2014 where we hosted Enrico Letta, who had been Italian Prime Minister. And in his lecture in 2014, he talked towards the end about something that he feared might happen and that people should take more seriously than they were, and he called it Brexit. And the lecture finished, and I had to ask the person sitting next to me, what's Brexit? Never heard the word before. That was 2014. There's one more thing we need to say about Act 3 in Shakespearean terms, which is that we haven't yet reached the apogee of Peter Mandelson's power in British politics, because that came after an attempted coup against Gordon Brown in 2009, when one of his ministers, James Parnell, resigned, had another, David Miliband, resigned at the same time. It would almost certainly have brought down Gordon Brown. When James Parnell was asked why he hadn't coordinated with David Miliband, he said, well, that would have made it a plot, which in itself was an interesting answer. Brown, in desperation that night, got Mandelson to ring around and rally support. It took a bit of time to come. Ministers had to be dragged kicking and screaming in front of the cameras to defend their beloved leader, but they did in the end, and Brown survived. And Mandelson's reward was to be made effectively Deputy Prime Minister and to be given a whole host of titles which seem to have come from a Shakespearean history play. Wasn't he made Lord High Protector?
Lord President of the Council, First Secretary of State.
So not quite Lord High Protector, that's my memory.
He's definitely got some Thomas Cromwell element to it, I think.
So that, in this story, it's almost like that is the point, I think, in this history play where we are halfway through, that these two men who loathe each other, have not just reconciled, but there's a mutual dependency, which is almost like a blood tie at this point. Mandelson is keeping Brown in office, and Brown knows it, and Mandelson knows it. And then, only now with hindsight, what's also haunting about that is we've seen the emails that Peter Mandelson was writing to Jeffrey Epstein at the same time. That was part one of a two-part conversation. We've reached somewhere in the middle of Act 3. The second part, covering Acts 4 and 5, taking the story right up to the present day, is going to be out tomorrow on PPF+. Here's a short extract. At one point, they're all obsessed with how does Labour win an election again. But winning elections for Mandelson is his life's work. It really is his life's work.
Yeah, and I think that he sees that the person who's got the best chance of, or seems anyway to have the best chance of doing that, who is non-Corbynista, is Keir Starmer.
In this play, a character who would enter late on is Morgan McSweeney, and Morgan McSweeney is central to Act 5. There is a view that Morgan McSweeney is a Peter Mandelson creation and Keir Starmer is a Morgan McSweeney creation. It's too simplistic to put it in those terms, but is it wrong?
I think that they're both Peter Mandelson creations.
Wow. So McSweeney's role has been overstated and Mandelson's understated in the Starmer project. You are probably sick of me saying this if you've heard our recent episodes with some highlights from PPF. But if you would like to get that and all of our bonus episodes, plus ad-free listening, sign up now. Click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. A quick reminder about an event that is coming up quite soon. It's the third screening in our season at the Regent Street Cinema in London. It's on Wednesday, May the 6th. There are just a few tickets left. I'm going to be talking to the writer, journalist and now host of BBC Radio 4's In Our Time, Misha Glenny, about Carol Reed's masterpiece, The Third Man. To get your tickets, click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time in our regular slot, it is the episode we recorded in the second of our screenings at the Regent Street Cinema. I'm going to be talking to Beeban Kidron about the South Park movie. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.